Hello and welcome to the Wixoss Diva Alive Episode 1 review. I'm Callan.
And I'm Honey Panda Bunny.
So if you've heard my previous video in which I talked about Wixoss Diva Alive, you'll know that I'm a really big fan of the franchise. And I've also brought my sister in for this review. What's your overall attachment to the series?
So I've really enjoyed Wixoss, and I remember when it was coming out I didn't manage to find the time to watch it, but eventually you showed it to me and I became really invested really quickly. And I remember it was at the time I think that Conflated had come out, where I'd finally sat down and watched all of the seasons all together in a huge binge watching session, and I super enjoyed all of them, well, for the most part.
Getting into the actual episode for this series. Going into the episode, my expectations were fairly low. I covered this in my prior video, having not been very impressed with the PV, and researching as to who was working on the project didn't give me much encouragement. And while the first episode I wouldn't say was very good, I would also say it wasn't terrible either. It was just fairly bland and very generic introduction to this new series. I wouldn't blame any fan, either of the original or a potential new one, to drop it after this episode. There were a few positives, but when they should have come out swinging, it felt like they played it a bit too safe.
I'd say with my initial thoughts, it does feel a little bit like a downgrade with this series. But some of the parts of it have piqued my interest. Like you said, there are a couple positives. So it is holding my attention for now, but we'll see in the future how long it'll keep it.
So I will say right out the gate, the animation is very rough, and it feels choppy compared to what came before. There are the occasional bits, such as the transitions to and from the virtual reality, that look nice, but unfortunately most of the time it looks very much like an eyesore. I did really like the beginning of the episode when it was set with the lights down in the darkness, and you saw the camera trailing around the characters. It felt that the direction was trying some new things, but they didn't do much past this.
Yeah, when I was watching that opening bit, I think I even mentioned, while it does look interesting, it almost felt like there was frames missing from it. It didn't run as smooth as I thought it could have. And some of the style and the way it moves feels a little bit awkward. And I don't feel much weight when they're fighting. When things are colliding, it doesn't feel like there's a weight there.
Yeah, it does feel very light and floaty.
And then on top of that, there's these effects that go over when weapons
They
collide,
clash.
yeah. And the effects are just a bit too much for what's going on. I think it covers half of the screen.
Yeah, the battles have been made much more flashier compared to the prior seasons. With the player and the Lurig's roles essentially being merged, this isn't necessarily a good thing, because while it does allow for much more dynamic fights, it does come at the cost of being able to follow them. In the previous series, you were never able to know how to play the game, but you could still follow who was winning, who was losing. You could get the general gist of the battles. But here I found the battles very jumbled. They felt a bit of a mess until the main characters got their protagonist powers at the end, and then they just won.
Yeah, it did feel like there was a lot of flash and not a lot of substance going on. But there are portions that I did actually like that were animated, and one of them that I will mention is the roof. I thought everything on that roof looked very pretty. The animation seemed the smoothest to me at that point, and it did look genuinely good at that point. So I could see where it could go ahead if they put a bit more effort in, and we could see some really good portions.
And I'll extend that as well, as I actually really like the idea of the virtual reality world, because when they're on that skyline and they're showing out the virtual city, it actually looks really interesting. It looks like a really cool cityscape that's been created in this virtual reality, and I hope it doesn't remain just a backdrop. I actually would really like them to take advantage of this setting and let's explore more of this world outside of the stage. Even if it's just the protagonists occasionally hanging out there, it would be a nice change of scenery.
Yeah. Another thing that I will mention that I like animation-wise is I like the effects of the wish in and wish out. Anytime those kind of things come up, they always look really smooth and nice. So that's just something for me that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, the transitions from going into the Wixoss land and leaving are actually really cool, and I do like the bits of English as well. It adds a bit of mystique to it. So going on to the main characters, I find them to be they feel like template characters. They're very disappointing. It feels very much like a downgrade from even prior series, as I feel like they lack a lot of the soul. Hirana as a main character, she feels like a very stock standard character that's just plucked straight from a kid's anime. Her personality is just that she wants to be the best diva and stand up for Wixoss and the fans, who are the selectors behind it, against the bullies in this episode. She's not a particularly deep character, although I will say that the bit I really did like was towards the start part where after her first team disbands and she starts crying, you see that her thoughts are being written out as she's crying, and it's talking about how she's frustrated, about how she's disappointed that she's doing her best but she's still lost. And I actually really liked the idea of her lamenting her loss. Her frustrations being poured out like that felt really genuine for a moment, and it gave me flickers of the Selector era. It did give me that, especially with the text, it felt very darkish. Unfortunately, this wasn't really followed up on later in the episode, but hopefully this aspect of her character isn't dropped, as this going forward could add the depth to her that I think she's sorely lacking at the moment.
Yeah, I do feel like she does have that kind of like protagonist syndrome kind of going on here, with how, I want to say cookie cutter she is at the moment. Obviously this is the first episode, so she could have a really big growth arc, but right at the moment she just feels quite boring in the way that she's just all energetic main character, very standard.
I also have very little to say on Akino, the blonde one. She was just kind of there for me.
If I did have to say, if I had to pick a favourite so far, I think she would be my favourite in the sense of she seems interested in Wixoss, but she says, oh, I'm not very good at playing it. So there is some sense of growth that she could have through the series already kind of being set up.
She did bring up something that I think you mentioned finding interesting, was the idea of appealing to the selectors in the crowd with the costumes.
It was something that I liked about it, of the whole idea of whether the way that you act and the way that you present yourself as a Lyrig is the whole sole point of getting people to be on your side, the SP obviously. So the idea that people would go and maybe wear something skimpier to get more attention, or act in a certain way to get more attention, it feels very reminiscent of almost having like VTuber or like online persona, where people who present themselves online, an identity is completely different to how they are in person. And it was something that I really wish that they pick up on and work through.
It could definitely be an in-series explanation for the increased fan service in this series, I find. And the whole selector aspect that you mentioned of the battles is actually really interesting, with the fans pledging their support to the divas. And I also really like that it doesn't actually affect the outcome. Winning or losing is still the same, but it's just if you have more selectors on the side, the more SP you gain and the higher you increase yourself in the rankings. I like that it serves a really large role without impacting the actual battles. It actually feels like a little bit of clever writing. But going back to the characters, I would like to talk about Rei, because I also found her to be a very template character. She just feels like the rival type that pushes too hard to be the best. You see that with her team. You see this in anime all the time, as the character that whatever it is they're passionate about, they don't see it as a game to anyone else. They're super serious about it. And Rei doesn't really offer any unique twist on this archetype. I will say one positive I do like is I really like her real world design, the one with the glasses. It's the only design of the main characters that I like at the moment, both in or out of the virtual world. However, I did find at the end the reveal to be so by the formula that I didn't even register it as a twist. It just felt like I didn't even really react to it.
Yeah. I think for me, when it comes to her, I think that she could be the one that maybe would have the most character growth. This idea of her being like, oh, it's not a game, I have to be serious about it. And then it coming on later in an episode where it's like, oh, you have to grow closer with your team. Or she goes, oh, I have to leave this team because they're not working. Maybe that kind of like breakup idea.
I definitely hope they do emphasize on that, because in this episode you have the thing where it's implied that she keeps falling out with teammates because she doesn't find the other two ever taking it seriously as she does. But then at the end of the episode she seemingly does have a team that is on her level in terms of wanting to be serious about this. So I do hope that it does get brought up in later episodes, because it would add a bit of intrigue to the team base.
You could also have an interesting conflict between, is it Akino, the blonde?
Akino, yes.
Yes, her and Rei. And obviously because Akino is like, oh, I don't know whether I want to be a Lyrig, go participate. So they could have an interesting kind of meeting in the middle, because one of them's like, oh, this is super serious, and the other one's like, oh, I don't know whether I want to do it. So
yes. And speaking of designs, I really don't think they've translated well to this medium. I said this in my prior video, but there wasn't any design that particularly stood out to me. And even now, any of the Lyrig designs, none of them are still doing it for me, unfortunately. But I did have a look at some of the cards in the real world, the ones from the new Diva set, and they actually really look good. It is such a shame that the anime is unable to catch that feeling, unfortunately, because some of the main designs actually look really good there. They look so much better.
Yeah, I do think that the designs look kind of gaudy, and the initial ones that they had, I actually really liked when they were in their first teams. I actually quite enjoyed them. They looked simple, they didn't need to be any bigger than what they were, if that makes sense, and it looked good. And then obviously they went into their other outfits, and while I'm not a huge fan of them, I do think that they look okay for the most part. And then obviously obviously their human designs are interesting for the most part as well, but everything just seems bigger and puffier here.
Yes.
So it really feels like a different world with these characters.
It does feel very much aimed for a younger audience. So for references, I've mentioned before that the uniform is the one that is from Lost Origin cited, and we also get a little reference to an original character, Tama, because when they're looking at the billboard, it says Tama, as in the lyric from the first series, and she's saying Bataru, 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 which is her iconic catchphrase. I don't think this confirms that she's going to be in the anime, I just think it's a cute little nod to the old series. The series at the moment appears to be an alternative universe with nothing to do with what came before. I think these are just cute little nods at the moment. Going back to the designs, you can tell who has a mainline design and who has a design that's just made for the anime. Despite that, I actually thought the bully characters, I don't remember any of their names, I thought they actually had some okay designs, and I actually preferred them to the main characters. They weren't exactly particularly interesting characters, but I did find them a little bit entertaining. They ain't no Aki Lucky, but they brought a bit of energy and fun to the episode, I found. They pulled some of the faces that reminded me of the older Wixoss, the scary faces, and I did like that the main girl had a weird protractor weapon with a witch hat on it. I don't know why, but it looked cool. I liked her shadow wings as well, and when they lost they came off as very Team Rocket with them pulling faces and leaving, and I wouldn't mind them coming back as a bit of comic relief. I could certainly do with a laugh.
I did really like these designs actually. I like the witch with the gun. She looks so cool. Like, I thought she looked really cool when she was moving.
I really like the one with the bag as well.
Yeah, the backpack hat. That was
cool.
actually one of my favourite portions of it. I like the idea of having a backpack that can be used as a weapon. It feels quite unique.
So, I would say not a particularly amazing first episode. There's a lot of flaws already being shown, but there are hints as well as to what came before, teasers of darker aspects. However, the first episode of the series usually establishes what type of series it will be going forward, and this one does feel a lot lighter compared to what came, and I feel that that won't change. However, I'm in for the long haul, so hopefully the next episode will improve on some of the issues we brought up.
And one thing before we do wrap up is I also wanted to comment on the avatars in the background. The whole idea of having the most random avatar possible. You could be like a cat all the way to being a fully
There's the little
fleshed.
ghosts.
And I actually really wish that some of the lyrics would be a bit more cartoony like that. I feel like it would actually differentiate this a lot more from the older series, because it does seem like they're going in a different direction.
So thank you very much for listening to our new review for Wixoss Diva Live.
Thank you very much.
Until next time.
Bye bye.